Hello and welcome back. This week's topic is the Age of Imperialism, a period that witnessed the building of new physical and economic global empires roughly between 1870 to 1914. We will concentrate on the physical expansion of European empires into Africa and Asia during this period. However, we will also touch on the emergence of a new and perhaps more successful style of imperialism called neo-colonialism, which centered on economic and not physical domination, in which the United States employed in Latin America at the end of the 19th century. Let's start with the physical empires established by the Europeans in Africa and Asia in the late 19th century. There were a number of motives for the Europeans to take interest in these continents. Among the most relevant, especially if one is to take a Marxist approach, were economic motives. Africa and Asia offered industrialized European nations access to a wide variety of raw materials, including tea, rubber, and coffee that could not be grown in Europe proper. Not only that, but the conquest of these lands would provide the European countries with ready-made markets for the manufactured goods they produced in their newly built factories. Nationalism also became a strong driving force for imperial expansion. By physically expanding in other continents, European nations could feed the nationalist thirst for land and power without having to directly fight against their European neighbors. In addition, the nationalist drive that typically accompanied the imperial expansion into Africa and Asia succeeded in deflecting class conflict back home. Because belief in the nation was egalitarian, meaning that all citizens had equal bragging rights about their nation's power, the working class often found itself caught up in the nationalist fervor that accompanied imperial expansion. This nationalist desire for expansion soon devolved into an increasingly competitive approach to imperialism. European nations saw in imperial expansion into Africa and Asia the perfect way to prove to their neighboring and competitor nations who was most powerful. Europeans wanted their place in the sun. The overseas empires offered European nations a way to compete against each other without having to directly confront each other in the battlefield. You can see in these maps of Africa and Asia the rabid hunger for empire that the Europeans displayed between 1870 and 1914. On the left you can see the division of Africa. The orange sections were occupied by France, the yellow by the English. The purple on the lower half of the African continent were German. Perhaps the most impressive, however, was the Belgian Congo in the center, in blue. Belgium was more than 10 times smaller than the colony it controlled in Africa. Asia presented an interesting variation. If you look at the map on the right, areas in green remained independent. The most notable region was the English Empire, which resisted in the way it could physical domination by European nations. As we will see, however, this did not keep the Europeans and the United States from heavily influencing economic and political policies of this declining Asian empire. Missionary goals also motivated Europeans. The mission was the same that had inspired the Spanish in their conquest of the Americas, converting to Christianity the natives of what were considered uncivilized lands. Yet the European missionary zeal was motivated by more than just religious differences. A strong European ethnocentrism influenced the desire to civilize the Africans and Asians. The growing popularity of what came to be known as scientific racism led Europeans to consider themselves the dominant race on Earth. They considered their mission that of dominating the world so as to improve the racial stock of humanity. As the Frenchman Comte de Gobineau wrote in 1853 in his On the Inequality of Races, Europeans largely saw themselves as physically, mentally, and morally superior. The drawings on this slide are especially telling of European notions of race at this time. On the left, you can see a contemporary comparison of what were considered racially perfect European Greek skull formations with that of African men. In the eyes of Europeans, the racially inferior African had a stronger inclination in his forehead, similar to the chimpanzees at the bottom of the drawing. The implication is clear. The more slanted the forehead, the more animalistic the human. The same argument is apparent in the drawing on the right, based on racial theories of Peter Camper, an 18th century artist that developed racist theories to facilitate drawing the faces of different ethnic groups. As you can see in the drawing, The slanted forehead is taken even further, implying that the increase in angle leads from Greek perfection to the underdeveloped African to eventually the animal, in this case a frog. As crazy as these correlations between human physique and intellectual development might seem to us today, they were quite prevalent in Europe and the United States during the 19th century. They were pseudo-scientific arguments based more on racist thought than any serious scientific research. Yet, even with all these motives behind them, the Europeans would not have had the chance to conquer the African and Asian continents if it had not been for two critical technological advances: the development of the machine gun and of the chemical quinine. Machine guns such as the German-designed Maxim gun pictured here made it possible for Europeans to fight much larger contingents of native Africans and Asians, defeating them with ease. The new weapon could be manned by one or two people, yet could fire between 600 and 800 bullets per minute. That was a much faster rate of fire than the typical 6 to 10 shots per minute that a single soldier could fire with a traditional rifle. Yet the most revolutionary advent of the period was quinine, which allowed Europeans to survive the deathly effects of malaria, a disease which had previously struck close to half of the European soldiers fighting in these areas. With quinine, Europeans could resist the health dangers of fighting in Africa and Asia and could concentrate on conquering the land. You can see in these two images how Europeans saw themselves in relation to the natives of the lands they conquered. The machines of the industrial era came to represent for Europeans the true measure of a developed civilization. On the left, you can see a glorified representation of factory life. The young girl is manning a complex threading machine, the sign of technological advancement. Notice that she is well dressed and clean. The native Africans on the right, however, are represented working with simple tools. For the Europeans, then, possession of machinery equaled technological advancement, which in turn justified their imperial expansion. Africans and Asians were seen as primitive, underdeveloped, and as a consequence should submit, becoming colonized by the more civilized Europeans. This notion of European superiority was clearly evident in most writings about imperial expansion. Cecil Rhodes, an Englishman turned millionaire after he traveled to South Africa to build diamond and gold mines, believed in English racial superiority. You can see him relaxing near one of his mines in the image on the left. He founded the diamond monopoly De Beers, which to this day controls more than 3/4 of the world's diamonds, and is also responsible for the establishment of the prestigious Rhodes Scholarship to study in England. In Rhodes' eyes, the English were the most civilized and therefore most racially advanced people in the world. As such, they deserved to conquer the world in the name of civilization and peace. In his Confession of Faith, written in 1877, he argued in favor of establishing a secret society that would work toward that goal. The image on the right also exemplifies the attitude of European superiority. The English explorer is fully dressed, a sign of civilization in European eyes, and is being served by the half-dressed or half-naked, depending on your interpretation, native African. The arrival of European influence in Africa and Asia did have its advantages, however. Among the most salient were the improvement of sanitation, especially in cities, the improvement of agricultural techniques, and the establishment of better communications infrastructures with the building of railways and telegraph lines. Nevertheless, the advantages of empire did not outweigh the disadvantages for Africans and Asians. European control quickly put an end to native production of finished goods to ensure European goods could be sold in the colonies instead. Also, subsistence farming, the growth of basic foodstuffs necessary for basic survival, was replaced by single-crop farming, the growing of crops that could be sold in Europe, such as cacao, tobacco, or even opium. This raised prices of food for local populations, which had to be imported from other regions. In addition, wages were largely based on ethnicity, meaning that skin color influenced the wages. Lastly, European colonization led to the destruction of native social and cultural systems, as the Europeans imposed their own cultures. Now I want to discuss different reactions to European imperialism. I've decided to concentrate on three examples in Asia, with China, Japan, and India. China represented a conservative or traditionalist reaction to European expansion, centered on the rejection of everything European. Japan, on the other hand, reacted by modernizing and competing directly with Europeans for imperial possessions in Asia. Lastly, India resisted British rule with the development of an anti-imperialist nationalism that eventually was heavily influenced by the pacifist ideals of Mahatma Gandhi. We will first look at China. The Chinese reaction to European encroachment is especially interesting because China was a long-standing empire in Eastern Asia. Though initially interested in trading with Europe, China began to withdraw into an isolationist position as the 19th century progressed. The British sale of opium in China became an important point of contention between the two countries. The Chinese government illegalized the sale, afraid of the negative impact its consumption was having on the Chinese population. Rather than respect the Chinese wishes, though, the British went to war against the Asian Empire, afraid that they would lose their very profitable opium market there. The British won the First Opium War with relative ease, their weapons and powerful navy determining the conflict in their favor. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, put an end to the war. It not only forced the Chinese government to reopen its borders to the opium trade, it also required the Asian government to compensate the British for the loss of sales during the war. After China lost a second opium war a few years later, it became clear that the empire was in decline and could not easily compete with Great Britain. Other European nations, including France and Germany and even the United States, soon joined Britain in establishing port cities that gave them access to the large Chinese market. This came to be known as the carving up of the Chinese melon. China continued to resist Western influence with periodic rebellions, but these were typically easy for Westerners to control. The most famous of these uprisings was the Boxer Rebellion in 1899, which saw the cooperation of Europeans and Americans to put it down. By the way, you might have noticed the misprint on the slide. The rebellion did not occur between 1989 and 1899, but rather in 1899. Sorry about that. While China continued to resist Western influence, Japan took a radically different approach to outside influences. After centuries of complete isolation, Japan opened its borders to the West in the mid-19th century. The new Meiji Emperor, whom you see on the right, made a strong commitment to Westernization of Japan. Starting in the 1870s, hundreds of Japanese were sent by their government to Europe and the United States to study in Western universities, observe the functioning of Western governments, and learn the technological developments of industrial economies. They then returned to Japan and applied their learned knowledge to the restructuring of the Japanese government, economy, and even culture. The drawing on the left is from the late 19th century, and it shows from right to left the evolution of the Japanese male from traditional conservative to advanced Western man, with top hat and dog included. The Westernization of Japan included an increased desire for imperial expansion, the development of a strong nationalism similar to that which emerged from Europe, and the rapid growth of the Japanese industrial complex facilitated the military conquest of Korea in 1895. Using modern military tactics and dressed in uniforms reminiscent of the great European powers, the Japanese military was greatly successful on the battlefields of Asia. It even dared to engage Russia, a European empire, over control of Port Arthur, a peninsula in the Yellow Sea between Korea and China. The Russo-Japanese War lasted less than a year, but it saw the destruction of the Russian Baltic Fleet and was a resounding victory for the Japanese. The first time in the modern period that an Asian country defeated a European one. The victory transformed Japan into a major imperial power, solidifying its control of Korea and opening up Manchuria to its influence. The image on the left shows the Western-styled uniforms I was talking about, worn by the modernized Japanese army. The image on the right, however, shows the continuance of certain military traditions, such as what we see here, the beheading of spies with a samurai sword. Unlike China and Japan, India suffered physical occupation by the British. In fact, India was considered by the British to be the jewel of their empire, providing many raw materials for British manufacturing and a large ready-made market for the sale of finished goods. Initially, the colony was regulated by a private company called the British East India Company, with its own administrators and army. Profits obtained from the Indian colony were divided with the British government. This changed, however, when Indians frustrated with the British presence rose up in 1857 in what the British came to call the Sepoy Mutiny. The Indians referred to the popular uprising as the Great Rebellion. After putting down the rebellion, the British government decided to impose direct rule, eliminating the East India Company and its role as an administrator in the colony. Indian resistance continued, however, with the formation of the Indian National Congress, a political party that increasingly represented the frustrations of Indians with British rule and pressed for independence for India. British direct rule successfully administered the Indian colonies until well into the 20th century. Indian resistance, however, began to shift towards non-violent resistance. Led by the European-trained lawyer Mahatma Gandhi, a declared pacifist, Indian anti-imperialist nationalism slowly eroded British structures of power in India until it gained its independence from Great Britain in 1947, just after the end of World War II. In the end, imperialism would not fulfill the initial expectations of Western nations. As the 19th century came to a close, it became more and more evident that the spread of empire had not stabilized the great powers. Rather than minimizing competition between European nations, imperialism actually increased it, raising levels of friction between European nations. In addition, controlling the new imperial markets became more and more costly, requiring more and more troops to maintain order. The civilizing goals of the Europeans did not succeed either, mainly because the Europeans themselves were in fact not very interested with the development of their colonies, just with their exploitation. And in a paradoxical turn, the same nationalistic ideologies that motivated the spread of empire soon began inspiring local resistance to the Europeans. Finally, the continued competition between European powers in Africa and Asia increased the political tensions between them, contributing very directly to the outbreak of World War I in 1914. However, there existed an alternative model of empire that did not require physical conquest, but which provided steady and dependable economic profits. This model was called neocolonialism. The success of this strategy centered on obtaining direct influence in foreign governments with the aim of receiving favors from them that would allow powerful nations to establish manufacturing companies and purchase plantations. This model was especially prevalent in Latin America, where especially Great Britain and the United States used their economic influence to impose political caudillos and dictators that would best represent their interests. The dictators, placed in power through outside economic assistance, or in some cases direct military action, assured the maximization of profits for British and U.S. companies by ensuring public order. The economic and political domination of Latin America by the United States was clearly outlined by President Theodore Roosevelt in his address to Congress in 1914, when he proclaimed that the United States would act as what he called an international police power in the area of Latin America if its interests were challenged. On this map, you can see the result of U.S. foreign policy in the early 20th century. Each of the arrows you see represents a military operation launched by the United States to quote-unquote police its southern neighbors. Looking back, neocolonialism has proved to be a more profitable alternative to physical empires. In fact, while physical imperialism has largely been discarded by Western powers, neocolonialism remains quite popular. The United States especially has used its economic and political influence to manipulate political shifts in governments across Latin America. To this day, the legacy of empire continues to affect the development of Latin America. And we will end there. That's it for now. So take care, and I will see you next week. Good luck with all your assignments.